Muito bom dia, eu sou Luísa Meireles, membro da direção do Clube de Lisboa e tenho a honra de hoje poder conversar com o Mr. David Cameron, ex-primeiro-ministro do Reino Unido entre 2010 e 2016 e que é hoje copresidente do Conselho sobre a Fragilidade dos Estados. A Fragilidade dos Estados é precisamente o tema desta nossa conversa e devo lembrar a todos que nem todos os Estados pobres são Estados frágeis. Há Estados que são particularmente frágeis devido a um longo processo de fragilidade das instituições, redes várias de terrorismo, de tráfico de droga, etc., mas que, de qualquer modo, a pandemia da Covid-19 veio agravar brutalmente a situação em que vivem estes países. É um facto que, para além do mais, estes países não têm a ajuda internacional a estes países não tem sido aquela que, enfim, gostaríamos que fosse. É verdade que todos nós vivemos em pandemia, há dificuldades para todos, mas não podemos deixar que a pandemia torne o mundo ainda mais desigual. E é isto que nos traz aqui hoje nesta discussão, que eu gostaria que fosse uma conversa, não é uma discussão, será um debate, será uma conversa com o Mr. Cameron, que sem dúvida nos trará alguns elementos importantes sobre isto. Eu só gostava de recordar aquilo que muitos dos nossos dirigentes nos têm dito. Nenhum de nós estará a salvo até que todos estivermos vacinados. E isto significa vacinar o mundo inteiro. É um grande desafio para toda a humanidade. Mr. Cameron, por favor.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me to speak at your conference and to do an interactive session with you. I'll just introduce this issue by asking and trying to answer a series of very straightforward questions. First of all, why am I talking at this conference? Well, as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, I led a government that was the first G7 country to achieve the target of 0.7% of gross national income given in aid payments and overseas aid, which I think was hugely important. I'm deeply sorry that my successor governments have pulled back from that, but Britain remains a very big aid donor. And I'm also, as Prime Minister, saw very clearly the difference between tackling poverty generally around the world and trying to tackle poverty and disadvantage in the most fragile countries. And this led me, after leaving office, to do some research and work on this and become co-chairman of the Council on State Fragility. I co-chair that with Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the former president of Liberia, and Donald Kaberuka, the former finance minister from Rwanda. And what the Council does is bring together politicians, practitioners, and academics to try and answer some very specific questions about, well, yes, there's a problem of state fragility. Loads of countries and loads of people are being held back by these issues. What are the practical steps that we could take that would make a difference? That's what the Council is there for. Why is such a council necessary? Well, as you're well aware, by 2030, it's likely that 50% of the world's poorest people will be in fragile states. As you said in your introduction, there is a difference between people in poverty in countries like India or China, where the growth of those countries and action by those governments will over time lift people out of poverty, and those people stuck in states which are in many cases have been going backwards rather than forwards in their economic development. And the fact that 50% of the world's poor will be in those countries by 2030 speaks volumes for how important addressing the fragile states issue is. Also, if we want to achieve any of the global goals that the United Nations and the world signed up to, we simply won't achieve them unless we address the problems of state fragility. And I think the other reason why a council is so necessary and why this work is so necessary is, we should be frank, the approaches that have been taken in the past, many of them have failed. I'm a big supporter of aid and development, as I said at the beginning, and of wealthy countries putting their shoulders to the wheel and adding the resources that are necessary. But we should be honest that in some cases, this hasn't worked because I think we haven't addressed the issues that are really holding these countries back. So what should we do differently? Well, obviously, we did a huge amount of work on this and research, but I could break it into some simple headlines. The first thing is we need realism, not idealism, recognizing in fragile states with very difficult issues of weak institutions, of corruption, of weak levels of trust and legitimacy, often recovering from conflict, trying to achieve every goal at the same time and having grandiose ideas about what can be done doesn't help. Some realism, some practicality is necessary. Second, you need to focus on local priorities rather than handing down a set of international priorities. Third, it's vital that we work with governments rather than going around governments. Many well-intentioned aid interventions fail because they actually undermine the governments and the institutions that they are attempting to help. And I think working with governments is essential. I think one of the most controversial findings of our inquiry that informs our work now is that we should try and prioritize efforts at reconciliation in fragile states rather than in a post-conflict situation rushing to elections. That's controversial because I'm a Democrat. We all want to see elections take place. We want legitimate governments. But actually the time spent trying to heal the internal divisions of a country through reconciliation, that is better than setting an election timetable that can often lead to further division in the country. What you don't want is one person, one vote once as the winner then takes over the country and the fragility issues remain. I think the final thing we did a lot of work on was to recognize that, of course, institution building is very important. We must make sure that countries that have had weak institutions have stronger institutions, and we should help with that. But also a sense of nation building is important as well as institution building. Countries often come out of fragility, and Rwanda would be a good example here, because there has been a sense of a national story being developed that the country can unite behind, and people therefore support the longer term decisions that governments need to make. So that's what we think should be done differently. Why is this so important right now? Well, in the midst of this terrible pandemic that has changed our world and seen the death of so many people over the last year and more, I think there's a very simple and important point to make. All the things that a country needs to fight a pandemic like this, all those things like resources, like trust in institutions and government, like strong institutions that are able to deliver things like the delivery of PPE or vaccines or public health issues, those things tend not to be there in the most fragile states. So what we've seen is in many cases, states that were fragile, that were already failing to tackle poverty and disadvantage, have actually been further disadvantaged by this pandemic. And so that is the danger, that the pandemic continues and these countries that are so essential in terms of tackling global poverty will fall further behind. What can be done? Well, I think we probably all agree that so far the international response and the actions of the G7, for instance, have been disappointing. I mean, to put it in simple figures, in a country like mine, something like 60% of adults are now vaccinated. In Africa, that figure is less than 2%. By now, over 300 million doses were supposed to have been delivered to Africa. The true figure is more like 20 million. Obviously, some promises were made at the G7 about vaccine delivery, and that is important. But I think we need to be frank that there's a short and medium and long-term plan required. In the short term, clearly, it is about delivering the resources, sharing the vaccines, delivering those vaccines through COVAX and other methods to the poorest and most fragile countries in the world. Next to that, medium term, but sort of short to medium term, is a really detailed plan of who is going to give what to whom and when and by what means. But I think what we've seen, and I'm not an expert in vaccines and vaccine delivery, but I think what we've seen points us towards a longer term plan, which is the reason why we're failing to get the poorest people in the poorest countries vaccinated is in part because the production of vaccines is so concentrated in particular countries. And of course, we can all talk about the dangers of vaccine nationalism, but I think we have to understand that there'll always be a problem of vaccine nationalism when you have a pandemic. And that adds to the importance of making sure you have a plan for properly sharing the technology, the expertise, the patents, everything else, into distributed centers of production, so that as we fight this pandemic and as we fight future pandemics, we have a far more robust and resilient way of producing and distributing vaccines. Final point I'd make by way of introduction, can the world, can steps be taken to make a difference? Well, I was very struck by the IMF paper that was produced that said for the cost of $50 billion, okay, a huge sum of money, that would be enough to perhaps vaccinate 40% of people in the poorest countries by the end of this year, 2021, and some 60% by July 2022. And they estimated that the benefit of such an approach would have a $9 trillion benefit return. That is something like 180 times the amount put into the scheme. And I think there are a few issues in international development with a higher rate of return than that. So I hope we can keep high up the agenda the issue of state fragility. It is absolutely crucial if we want to tackle poverty and meet the global goals. It's absolutely crucial if we are going to tackle this pandemic in a meaningful way, because as everyone would have said at this conference, there is no true safety until we are all safe, because this vaccine is mutating, spreading and respreading, as we're seeing at the moment with the Delta and other viruses. And I think there's a real need to do more and do more quickly for the poorest countries in the world as we combat this pandemic. Thank you again for having me on your panel today and addressing your conference. I think the G7 Plus is an excellent organization for bringing together some of these countries that suffer from issues of state fragility. And I hope that our work through the Council on State Fragility with my colleagues from Liberia and Rwanda and the support of LSE, London School of Economics and Oxford University and academics around the world, we can try and come up with practical ideas for what would make a difference, not just on issues, but also trying to help individual countries. I think one of the other things we found, and I'll finish with this, is that there are particular moments in the life of a country, perhaps when it's coming out of conflict or some big event has taken place, where there's an opportunity to tackle elements of state fragility. You can't always tackle every state at the same time. You need to make the most of the opportunities. And that goes to our whole approach of really emphasizing the importance of practicality rather than wild-eyed idealism. I hope that's a helpful introduction, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Muito obrigada, Mr. Cameron. Foi realmente muito interessante a sua intervenção e abriu pistas para conversarmos sobre diversos assuntos. Nesse sentido, eu gostaria de lhe, enfim, para o número que citou, de que metade da população mundial em 2030, ou seja, daqui a 9 anos, poder e viver em estados frágeis, é um número que nos deve assustar e que nos deve também convocar para a ação. E eu penso que é isso que também está subjacente à sua intervenção. Nesse sentido, eu gostaria de lhe perguntar quais são as razões para que um número crescente de Estados estejam a ser frágeis, ou melhor, estejam a cair na denominação de Estados frágeis.
I mean, to be clear, the figure I was using was looking at the percentage of the world's poorest people. So that is people living under $2 a day. What percentage of those will be living in fragile states? Because if we're trying to tackle global poverty, that's a very important figure. As I said, poor people in countries that have governments that are capable and economies that are growing, sort of India and China or what have you, that of course is a concern if you want to tackle global poverty, but those aren't the countries that most need our help. It's the ones that are fragile. Now, your question, why are there so many countries and what are the elements of fragility and why is this growing? What our inquiry found when we looked at this for over a year was that there is no one proximate cause of being a fragile state. It's not some people would, Is it simply the issue of conflict? Is it simply the issue of corruption? It tends to be a whole set of issues, each of which reinforces the other. If you take most states that suffer from these sorts of conditions, take somewhere like Somalia, for instance, you'll find it is that combination of conflict, corruption, weak institutions, a very weak sense of state legitimacy, very low levels of trust that people have for government, tending to have quite weak private sectors, not enough firms employing enough people, high levels of poverty. And each one of these issues reinforces the other. And what we found, and Somalia in many ways was the country that most brought me to the conclusion that addressing state fragility was absolutely crucial if we were going to tackle global poverty. And what we found is that there's no good just trying to identify and deal with one issue. You could remove the conflict, but you'd still have the weak institutions. You could change the weak institutions, but you'd still have the corruption. Each one reinforces the other. And we have to recognize that the approaches we've been taking up to now haven't been working. And so we were asking, which things should we turn around and do differently? And I think that's why those set of issues I mentioned about local priorities, not international priorities, working with governments rather than around them, and crucially this issue of elections, which is controversial, but I think it's very important to understand that if you have a country that is fractured, perhaps between different ethnic groups or different nationalities, that has been recovering from conflict, of course, over time, you want a legitimate elected democratic government, but rushing towards that. So often the Western countries and organizations come in and want to help a country and set an election timetable. And that often doesn't help because it just encourages the different ethnic groups or nationalities, the fissures in that country to get back into their separate camps rather than working out how to try and reconcile the different elements of a country and create a plan by which all the different elements of a country can buy into before actually moving to that election. So that I think is what makes up fragile states. Are there more of them? I'm not sure necessarily the number is increasing rapidly. I think what has been so depressing is that there are very few examples of countries recovering from a situation of fragility. As I say, the current approaches haven't worked. We shouldn't despair. There are countries that could well have been fragile, that avoided fragility because they took great decisions and had visionary leadership. Singapore would be a good example of that many years ago. And there are countries, like I mentioned Rwanda, where I think you'd say that is a country that was in a deeply fragile state, had that appalling conflict, and has recovered and is now one of the fastest growing and perhaps most successful states in Southern Africa.
Muito obrigada, Mr. Cameron. Acabou de dizer uma coisa que eu acho muitíssimo interessante e que já tinha dito na sua intervenção, que é efetivamente as abordagens anteriores fracassaram. Portanto, nós temos que fazer novas abordagens e o senhor propôs algumas. Uma delas, precisamente, é trabalhar com os governos e não à volta deles, na sua expressão. Muitas vezes acontece que estes Estados frágeis não têm governos, ou têm governos muito frágeis, ou que só governam parte do território. Como é que é possível, em particular, trabalhar com esta nova abordagem de trabalho com os novos governos? Com os governos dos países, dos Estados frágeis?
Well, I think you raise two issues that absolutely fit together. The first is if you have a situation where a government only is ruling over part of the country or only listened to by part of the population, perhaps because of ethnic or national or religious fissures in that country. And the first and most important thing is to try and achieve some form of national reconciliation. Now, we have seen examples of states that are extremely fragile or have elements of fragility where there's been a real attempt to try and achieve a settlement where different parts of the country all buy into a common plan. And if you don't do that, you'll never get anywhere. Now, of course, I mean, Lebanon as a country is a very fragile state, it's suffering great difficulties at the moment. But you can at least see that in a country like Lebanon, there was an attempt through the division of the various roles of state, the president, the speaker of the Commons, the speaker of the parliament, you know, of the different ethnicities and religious groups buying into a common plan for how the whole country was governed. So, you know, in any case, let's take the example of Afghanistan. I think looking back, it perhaps was a mistake to move so quickly in 2001, after 2001, into elections. And it was probably a mistake not to try and include in the governance of that country, if not the Taliban itself, then at least elements that properly represented the southern Pashtun population of that country. So I think your first point is, if you only have a government that governs part of the country and is only listened to by part of the country, you're never going to solve the issue of fragility. You have to try and achieve a very difficult thing, which is a national reconciliation. The second issue you raise about working through governments rather than around them, I think the very simple point we were making in our report and will continue to make today is that if you take a government of a country that is trying to exit fragility, it's trying to grow its economy, it's trying to make progress on all the global goals we're so familiar with, you're far more likely to succeed is if you find ways of trying to help that government deliver its agenda rather than imposing on it an agenda decided by those from the outside. We quoted in our report the example of one donor organization that was effectively saying to South Sudan, we really can't help you until you have announced your plans to combat climate change. Now, of course, we want everyone to combat climate change, but in South Sudan, combating climate change is not the most important priority for that country. The most important priority for that country is to have a government that functions, to have all the different ethnic and religious elements that are working together, and then try to build the elements of economy and security so that people can actually live some sort of a life. And then you can get on to issues like climate change. So work with a government, try and help them deliver their priorities within reason, rather than coming up with a whole set of international priorities that in some ways, sometimes aid agencies and donor governments can undermine a government by making it look as if the agenda is being imposed on that government rather than is the government's plan for getting the country back on track.
Relacionado com esta questão que acaba de dizer, das diferentes prioridades dos governos, nós, independentemente disso, sabemos que a pandemia abateu-se sobre todos e, tal como referiu, não é? Apenas 0,9% da população nos países de baixo rendimento receberam pelo menos uma dose, em contraste com os 22,6% da população mundial. Portanto, alguma coisa vai estar profundamente errada aqui. Como é que relaciona a pandemia ou quais são as perspectivas de solução da relação da pandemia e da solução da pandemia, da vacinação, com os Estados frágeis? Que perspectivas vê aqui?
Well, I think the current picture is, you know, extremely disappointing and very depressing in that, as I said, the Western world is managing to vaccinate its populations very rapidly, and the poorest countries in the world are way behind. And we have to ask ourselves, well, why has this happened? And why have the announcements that have been made and the measures put in place not managed to work? And I think the answer is relatively straightforward, which is that the organization that was set up to help deliver vaccines the world over, COVAX, I don't think we should blame COVAX. They're doing what they can with the resources that they have. They made a set of promises about delivering vaccines to Africa, and they haven't been able to deliver on them. And why is that? And the answer to that question is really about the wealthy countries monopolizing the delivery of vaccines, and the production not being adequately distributed. And I'm very influenced in this by listening to Strive Masuea, who I think might be addressing your conference, who was appointed the African Union envoy on vaccines and on the pandemic, but by the president of South Africa. And his point is that, you know, Africa, he was willing on behalf of the African Union to go and negotiate and buy vaccines, but this simply wasn't possible because wherever he was sent to go and talk to the vaccine producers, their production had already been effectively purchased. And in the biggest producer of vaccines is the institute in India. And what has happened all over the world is vaccine nationalism has kicked in, and countries, including India, have refused to export their vaccines. Now, I think I'm being sort of very simplistic here, but there are two ways of trying to address this for the future. One is to say, well, let's all oppose vaccine nationalism, try to stop this ever happening again. That's a very laudable aim, but I think it won't happen. When these crises come, it's I think always going to be the case that countries will put their own populations first. So it seems to me we have to take a second approach, which is to ask ourselves, why is vaccine production so concentrated in our world? Not just concentrated in the wealthy West, but also when it comes to the mass producer of vaccines, the Serum Institute of India, which is, I think, responsible for some huge figure, like almost 50% of the global production. That is really the mistake. What we need is for the vaccine producers and wealthy governments to work with pharmaceutical businesses throughout the developing world and make sure that the capacity for producing vaccines is far more widely spread. There are pharmaceutical companies in South Africa, in Rwanda, in other parts of the world where there are fragile states and many poor countries that are capable of manufacturing vaccines. And I think that's what the focus needs to be for the longer term, is having a far more resilient and distributed system for producing and licensing vaccines. Now, I see the argument for saying simply suspend the patents for the vaccines. And I can see the attraction of that, but I do wonder whether that's really the most important thing. Simply suspending the patent doesn't actually help with the issue of getting more vaccines into more arms of poor people in poor and fragile states around the world. And I think what's needed is more of a plan for sharing patents, sharing technology, boosting production in these other countries. Someone I think put it very well, is that, you know, simply suspending the patents is like providing someone with the ingredients for a recipe, but with no explanation of what should be done to bring that recipe to a conclusion. So I think it's about sharing expertise and technology and sharing patents rather than simply patent suspension. But there are many people more expert than me. But I do think in this practicality, what will really make a difference in the short, medium, and long term, that should be our guide, rather than simply wanting to make statements that sound very good but won't actually take the vaccine from the laboratory to the tarmac to the aeroplane and to the arm of the person it needs to go in.
Compreendo o seu ponto, mas eu gostaria de lhe perguntar então como é que acha, ou como é que é possível, vai haver naturalmente resistências, nomeadamente da parte dos produtores de vacinas e dos detentores da tecnologia de produção de vacinas. Como é que acha que é possível a nível mundial, enfim, qual é o melhor meio para que, enfim, se vençam essas resistências para haver essa partilha de tecnologia para produzir vacinas, como disse bem, há alguns países do chamado terceiro mundo ou países menos desenvolvidos têm efetivamente condições para o fazer.
Well, I think it would be wrong to see this as the sort of evil pharmaceutical big business companies on the one hand and well-meaning donors on the other hand. If you look at companies like AstraZeneca that has been so successful in producing a vaccine. I've had 2 shots in my arm of the AstraZeneca vaccine. They are actually delivering this vaccine without, on a non-profit basis. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what is the best route to make sure this never happens again? And I think suspension of patents sounds good, but as I say, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that more vaccines will be delivered. Whereas I think a plan that worked with the pharmaceutical companies and said, look, we need to have far more distributed production capability in future. So let's start with that now. Will you share your patents, your expertise, your tech with those pharma companies that are based in fragile states and in the continent of Africa? If you do that now, I think that's probably more likely to lead to a successful outcome than simply arguing for the suspension of patents, which then goes to the international organizations and could actually be held up for some time. We might not actually deliver what we want. So I don't think that the pharmaceutical companies in this sense are sort of immoral actors. I think they are perfectly capable of making moral choices if they're being approached in a practical and sensible way by the international community and governments to help make that happen. Now, of course, that's the longer term. Manufacturing these vaccines in pharma companies around Africa is right for the future. We do need a bigger effort right now to share the vaccines, and I think it's the case that right now wealthy countries have, the EU and US together have something like G7 and EU countries have 2.5 billion more doses than necessary for vaccinating their entire population. So I'm sure there's more can be done right now through COVAX and other means to spread those vaccines and to try and make up for this, appalling disparity of, as I said, 2% of African adults vaccinated, whereas in countries like the UK, it's closer to 60 or 70%.
Precisamente, o senhor na sua intervenção falou que as conclusões do G7 foram decepcionantes nestes termos, não é? Em termos da pandemia e dos objetivos que se pretendiam alcançar. Então, o que é preciso acontecer agora, depois do G7, e enfim, a nível da ordem mundial e nos países mais ricos, para que haja, na verdade, uma inversão das suas políticas e que se aumente a solidariedade internacional e a cooperação, quando também nós sabemos que esses países são confrontados com as suas próprias audiências nacionais, os seus próprios eleitores, para que resolvam rapidamente o problema das vacinações.
Well, first of all, there were some good elements to the G7. I mean, it was at least a coming together of some of the wealthiest countries in the world and a sense that there was a global responsibility. This was a far more positive outcome than there would have been when Donald Trump was leading the United States. So that was positive. There was the promise from the US, for instance, to buy and donate 500 million Pfizer doses and 1 billion by the middle of the year. The problem, though, is the scale of what is required is so much greater than that. I mean, that figure I just quoted of 1 billion doses by the middle of the year, that is only enough to vaccinate 10% of the population in the poorest countries of the world. So it's the scale. I think we've got now countries that want to cooperate, that are capable of cooperating, countries that do recognize their moral obligations, that also know that if we don't vaccinate more poor people in poor countries, we'll get more mutations, and these mutations will come back and bite us, quite apart from the carnage they can create in the poorest countries in the world. But the scale of what is required, that is where the G7 fell down. And I think those figures I gave you, 1 billion doses only does 10% of the poorest people in the poorest countries, and the West actually has 2.5 billion more doses than it needs. I think that is, bear that in mind, and then bear in mind what the IMF has said about what a fully scaled up program would deliver. A 50 billion program, you could vaccinate 40% of the poorest people in poorest countries by the end of this year. So there's a huge gap between what the G7 offered and what is required. And I think that is where we need to do better. I don't think we can wait till the United Nations General Assembly in September for trying to cobble together meetings there. I think there's a real urgency of trying to not resit the G7, but bring together countries of the G7 and other donors and other members of COVAX and say, right, what more can we do now? And where is the fully worked up plan for who's going to get what and when over the next few months? Because right now, what's being done is insufficient.
E o Conselho sobre a Fragilidade dos Estados, de que o senhor é co-presidente, está a trabalhar nesse sentido? E como?
What we do is, as I said, we bring together people who have run fragile states. Ellen Sirleaf Johnson from Liberia, Donald Kaberuka with his experience in Rwanda. I'm a co-chair of a country that cares passionately about helping to tackle world poverty, and my track record on that, I think, is one I'm very proud of. But we bring together that with a whole series of people who've worked in development at a very practical level in countries like Yemen and Pakistan and in African countries. And we bring that together with academic research, because we think it's very important not just to bring our own opinions and our own views about what might work, but to try and use academics like Professor Paul Collier from Oxford University, Tim Besley from London School of Economics, academics from around the world, to actually test, when it comes to interventions, what can make a difference. And so, for instance, on this issue, we met very early in the pandemic and made a whole series of suggestions about how production should be increased, about how COVAX could be boosted, and actually about this importance of better distributed production. We've also meet regularly to discuss either individual issues that we push for and do research on to try and show what can work. Recently, we've done that on the importance of green and distributed energy, because of course, one of the most practical ways to tackle poverty in any country is to ensure there are better connections to power and electricity. That used to be done by building big power stations and electricity grids. That often failed, particularly in fragile states, whereas distributed energy systems can be so much more effective, so much faster, and now actually cheaper. And we also have sessions where we try and look at the circumstance of an individual country and work out what the international community could do to help better. And so, for instance, recently we had a very good meeting with the new Prime Minister in Sudan, where, as I said, sometimes there's a moment in the life of a country where there's a real opportunity to affect change and to help support a government that is trying to lead its country out of a whole set of inherited problems. And I think Sudan is a good example of that, and where, action by the IMF, by international financial institutions, by donor governments can actually make a difference to help that country go from fragility to stability. So that's what the Council does. It's quite practical, quite down to earth. It does include some very clever academics who help us to test what actually works, but it's totally focused on the issue of state fragility. What are the elements of that fragility? How do we help unpick them? How do we help work in specific situations? And that is, I think, worthwhile. I mean, to take the example of the IMF, I mean, for many years, I think it did have pretty much the same approach to every country, irrespective of whether it was a developing state or a fragile state. And our argument has been you have to approach these things differently. We also assembled I think for the first time, a proper bringing together of all the development finance institutions, all the DFIs, to share expertise and say, well, what should we do differently when it comes to fragile states? I know from my own experience in the UK, where CDC, the former Commonwealth Development Corporation, I think has a brilliant track record. It's changed a huge amount in recent years. And one of the things it has done he said, look, we can always meet all our targets for investment by investing in relatively large, relatively safe countries. But that's actually not what we should be doing. We have to have targets to actually go into the most difficult situations, the most fragile states, often some very small countries. We may get lower returns. We may meet our targets less easily, but it's vitally important work. So there's a whole set of things. We're trying to change the way that development is done in order to target fragile states and help them. And that's the work of the Council. It's only a year or so old, so we're only in the foothills, but I think we're doing useful work.
Sim, e tal como o senhor disse, era necessário, precisamos de conter a pandemia global, a nível global, no próximo ano, até ao final do próximo ano, porque senão as consequências poderão ser desastrosas, não só de um ponto de vista económico, mas como estamos a verificar, a pandemia não é apenas uma crise sanitária, mas uma crise económica e social, e com o tempo pode tornar-se uma verdadeira catástrofe. Mas pensa que todos os países mais ricos estão conscientes de que isto pode ser mesmo que se não forem ajudados os países mais frágeis neste objetivo, isto é uma bomba relógio para todo o planeta, inclusive para os mais ricos?
I think that is absolutely right. I mean, I led a conservative government, and I always used to try and convince my colleagues that the arguments for aid and development were, of course, moral arguments, that we live on one planet. We should care about what is happening on the other side of that planet in the poorest countries and the poorest people. They are our neighbors too, and we should be generous because we're wealthy. There's a moral argument, but I'd also always make the sort of security argument that, if we allow countries like Somalia, I mentioned, if we allow countries like that to fall into further fragility, the problems created, whether it's the mass movement of people, whether it is environmental devastation, whether it's piracy on the seas, whether it's terrorism, those problems come back and visit us. So there's a self-interest here. And I think what this pandemic has done, amongst many other things, is it is an incredibly timely reminder that what happens in other countries affects us whether we like it or not. Here in the UK, it's great that we're getting to close to 70% vaccination of the adult population, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that we're going to be able to live with this pandemic. But we won't be able to live with it if on the other side of the world, this virus amongst people who are not vaccinated is mutating, and those mutations come back to us and possibly escape our vaccines and escape our tests and cause the problems all over again. So it has been an incredible reminder that we all share the same planet, and it's in our own personal and national interest to act more on a global basis. And I think that's what's disappointing in terms of my own government is I got Britain to 0.7% of gross national income on aid payments. And this government has, I hope, only temporarily come back from that. Britain is still a massive international donor at £10 billion, more like $14 billion a year in terms of overseas aid payments. But I'd like us back at that 0.7, and I'd like every G7 country to be at that level. It's a promise we made to the poorest people in the world. It's a promise that we should keep. And when you think about what's going to be necessary simply on the global health agenda, never mind the agendas of climate change and poverty and everything else, it's clearly going to be necessary to invest this money. Let me give you one example that I have a bit of sort of commercial experience in, which is we are going to need in every country to sequence the genome of the virus in order to spot the mutations. Now, we're doing that here in Britain. It's happening in most wealthy countries. That's how we discover these variants. The so-called Kent variant, the English variant it was called, was discovered because we were sequencing the genome of the virus. Now, that's great we're doing that, but we need every country to do that. We need a Gavi, a Global Alliance of Vaccines and Immunization, for sequencing. We need to make sure that the poorest countries, that institutions all over the world are sharing their information, sequencing viruses, finding the next either mutations of this virus or indeed future pathogens and viruses that could cause us problems, so we can act more on a global basis. So I think there's a whole set of new things that need to be done, quite apart from the existing agendas of tackling poverty and inequality and climate change, with which we're all so familiar.
Sei que estamos no limite do nosso tempo, só gostaria de lhe colocar uma questão que tem a ver com o problema da vacinação e desta pandemia, à medida que surgem as novas variantes. Nós já chegámos à variante Delta, sem dúvida que é capaz de surgir uma variante Epsilon e por aí fora, à medida que efetivamente não se vacinem as populações globais. Vão surgir novas variantes cada vez mais difíceis de controlar ou dominar através da vacinação. Como é que vê este problema? Como é que é possível, em conjunto, em termos internacionais, da solidariedade internacional, resolver esta questão?
Well, again, I think it comes back to this short, medium, long term. Short term, sharing vaccines, getting vaccines in the poorest countries is essential. We need to work through COVAX and other means to get it done. Medium term, a plan, absolutely setting that out. But this longer term issue of how we make sure there's vaccine expertise and production more widely spread, so it's more resilient the next time this happens. Because I can absolutely guarantee the next time this happens, the same issues of vaccine nationalism will arise. I mean, I'm a politician. I know what this is like. Of course, when something like this happens, the pressure to deliver for your own people and your own country is irresistible and understandable. But as well as that, in order to protect for the future, we do need, I think, I wouldn't argue for overhauling the World Health Organization. It has its strengths, it has its weaknesses, but I think sometimes these institutional reforms will take years and probably not deliver what's necessary. My suggestion would be that we add to the architecture that we have globally a global surveillance organization for pandemics. We know how to do this. We know that if you sequence new pathogens, new viruses, if you look at which conditions might jump from one species to another, if you deal with things quickly when they arise, we know we can respond better. I saw this as Prime Minister with Ebola, where I think the World Health Organization was slow and where it took countries like Britain and France and America to scale up and help countries like Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea to solve the problem. But it shouldn't be ad hoc. What we need is an organization set up as a network with a sort of hub and spoke model where all over the world you have scientific organizations sequencing viruses, spotting the next problems and pathogens, and sharing that information in a transparent, open, and non-political way. The danger with simply relying on the WHO is that politics inevitably come into it. When something like COVID-19 happens, do countries tell the WHO fast enough? No, they don't, because they're embarrassed about what they've found. Does the WHO tell the rest of us fast enough what needs to happen? In this case, no, because they were worried about the politics of blaming particular countries. So I think adding an organization that is simply about surveillance, about a sort of radar system, our Prime Minister has talked about at the G7, I think that will help. But that will only happen if we share the resources and expertise. We cannot expect the poorest countries to have the technical expertise, the equipment, and the resources to do this pandemic surveillance and sequencing and the rest of it. We're going to have to help them to do that. And again, it comes back to this issue of resources. We've now seen once again what a globalized, integrated world we live in, and therefore we shouldn't be holding back from spending aid money to help keep other people safe, because ultimately it will keep us safe too.
Mr. Cameron, acho que chegamos ao fim da nossa sessão. Eu gostei muito de poder conversar consigo e lembrava às pessoas, a todos os que estão a assistir, que efetivamente ouçam este apelo que Mr. Cameron acabou de fazer. É preciso mudar a arquitetura mundial do combate à pandemia. E isso diz respeito a todos e a cada um de nós. Muito obrigado, Mr. Cameron, pela sua intervenção e pela todo o seu tempo e explicações que nos deu aqui. Para os restantes, dentro de 10 minutos, às 10h45, haverá um novo painel dedicado à geopolítica e à diplomacia da pandemia. Muito obrigada a todos. Muito obrigada.
Thank you.